What could possibly shake the confidence of a man worth billions? Just 5 handwritten words on a folded piece of paper. Victor Langford was the kind of man people whispered about but never approached. In business magazines, his name sat next to headlines about billion-dollar deals and ruthless efficiency. In boardrooms, people waited for his verdict like it was a court sentence. But that night, in a dim corner of the Ironwood Grill in Kansas City, Missouri, he wasn't a titan of industry. He was just a man in a dark suit who wanted to eat in peace. The restaurant wasn't loud. No clattering plates, no loud music, just the quiet clink of silverware and the low murmur of conversations. Victor liked it that way. He hated noise. He hated distractions. He wanted the same thing he ordered every time he came here: a medium rare ribeye, a glass of red wine, and silence. The hostess led him to his usual booth near the back. Victor slid in, pulled out his phone, and scrolled through the day's closing numbers like a ritual. His fingers moved fast, his face expressionless. To him, food was fuel, and dinner was just another meeting. Except this one was with himself. But that night, there was a shift. Small, almost invisible at first. "Good evening, sir," a voice said. Victor looked up. Standing beside him was his waitress, a woman in her early 30s with tired eyes that still carried warmth. Her name tag read Danielle Moore. She wore the crisp black uniform the restaurant required, but it couldn't hide the exhaustion in her posture. Still, she smiled. Polite, practiced, professional. "What can I get you tonight?" she asked. Victor didn't waste time. Ribeye, medium rare, house red. Her pen scratched against the notepad. "Of course, I'll get that started for you." She turned to leave, but Victor's gaze lingered. He had a way of sizing people up instantly, as if scanning for weaknesses. Danielle wasn't sloppy. She wasn't inattentive. But there was something in her eyes, a weight she carried that most people in his world never noticed. Victor shook it off and went back to his phone. Numbers were easier than people. Numbers never asked questions. Minutes later, Danielle returned with his wine. "Your steak will be out soon," she said, setting the glass down carefully. He gave her a curt nod, already half absorbed in an email. She walked away without another word, but for a moment, her eyes lingered on him, just long enough for anyone watching closely to notice. Victor didn't. The Ironwood wasn't full that night. Just a few families, a couple on a date, 2 men in suits whispering over cocktails. But the quiet gave Danielle space to think, and thinking was dangerous. She glanced back at Victor as she refilled a water glass at another table. He looked so sure of himself, so untouched by the world outside his empire. She reached into her apron pocket. Folded there, already written, was a small piece of paper. She'd been carrying it for days, unsure if she'd ever have the courage to actually hand it to him. But seeing him now, flesh and blood instead of a face on a magazine cover, pushed her closer to a decision. Victor didn't know it yet, but his life was about to be disrupted, not by a competitor, not by a scandal, but by a waitress in Kansas City with a note that could strip away the armor he'd worn for decades. But Danielle wasn't ready to act just yet, and that hesitation would make what happened next even more powerful. Victor rarely looked up from his phone when waitstaff approached him. To him, service was expected, not appreciated. But Danielle didn't vanish into the background the way others usually did. She moved with a calmness that didn't match the restless tapping of his fingers on the table. She returned with a bread basket and set it down. "Fresh from the oven. Careful, it's hot." He didn't bother glancing at it. "Thanks," Danielle noticed. Most guests tore into that bread immediately, but he left it untouched. She hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever eat before the steak arrives?" Victor raised his eyes, faintly annoyed. "No, why?" "Most people can't resist. That bread disappears faster than the entrees half the time," she said, offering a small smile. He gave a short exhale, something close to a laugh, but clipped, controlled. "I don't eat filler. I eat what I came for." Danielle tilted her head. "Makes sense. You look like a man who knows exactly what he wants." Victor narrowed his eyes slightly. He wasn't used to small talk, not with waitresses, not with strangers. Most people tiptoed around him. Her tone wasn't disrespectful, but it carried a confidence that unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite place. "You always chat with your customers like this?" he asked. "Only the ones who look like they could use it," she replied. For the first time that night, Victor set his phone face down on the table. He studied her more closely now. The way her hair was pulled back neatly, the faint shadows under her eyes, the quiet strength in her voice. She was tired, yes, but not defeated. "What's your name?" he asked. "Danielle. Danielle Moore." Victor nodded slowly. "How long have you worked here?" 3 years. Before that, a couple different places. Restaurants pay the bills faster than dreams do." Her words carried a weight, but she delivered them casually, as if she'd repeated that line many times before. "Dreams," Victor repeated, rolling the word around like it was foreign to him. "And what's yours?" Danielle hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward the kitchen, then back to him. "Honestly, it doesn't matter right now. What matters is keeping a roof over my daughter's head." Victor raised an eyebrow. "You're a mother." "Single mother," she clarified, her tone steady. He didn't respond right away. He reached for his glass, swirled the wine, and took a slow sip. Something in her honesty disarmed him. She hadn't tried to impress him. She hadn't tried to complain either. She'd just said it, straightforward. "Your daughter?" he said at last. "How old?" 7. Smart as a whip, too. Already asking me questions I can't always answer. Danielle chuckled softly, then caught herself. She wasn't supposed to talk this much, but something about him, the man everyone feared in business, made her want to speak. Maybe it was because he looked untouchable, and deep down, she wanted to remind him that not everyone lived behind walls of glass and steel. Victor tapped the rim of his glass. "Kids ask questions because they haven't been taught what not to ask yet." Danielle smirked faintly. "Sounds like a man who used to ask a lot himself." He looked at her, almost startled by the remark. Few people dared to draw parallels between themselves and him. Before he could respond, the kitchen doors swung open. A server walked out carrying Victor's steak on a steaming plate. Danielle intercepted it quickly, adjusted the plate on her tray, and brought it over. "Ribeye, medium rare," she said, placing it down carefully in front of him. Victor's eyes flicked to the plate, then back to her. For the briefest moment, he thought he saw something in her hands. A folded piece of paper she quickly shifted back into her apron pocket before anyone could notice. He blinked. Did he imagine that? Danielle gave a professional smile. "Is there anything else I can get you?" Victor studied her face, his instincts prickling. He was a man who noticed details others missed, and right now, something told him that his dinner wasn't the only thing Danielle had prepared for him. But instead of pressing her, he picked up his knife and fork, not realizing that the real meal was waiting inside her pocket. Victor sliced into his steak with the precision of a surgeon. Each cut was clean, deliberate, the kind of control that reflected who he was outside the restaurant. He chewed slowly, savoring the flavor only because the chef here actually knew how to respect meat. Danielle moved between tables, topping off waters, smiling politely, but her thoughts weren't on her other customers. Her hand kept brushing the folded paper in her apron. Every time she felt its edges, her chest tightened. She told herself she'd hand it over tonight. She'd been telling herself that for a week, but fear always won. Who was she to approach a man like Victor Langford? He could laugh in her face. He could complain to management. Worse, he could do nothing at all. Still, tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way he'd actually looked at her instead of through her. Maybe it was the way he'd asked about her daughter like he cared, even if just for a second. She took a deep breath, grabbed a pitcher of water, and walked back to his table. "How's everything tasting?" she asked, keeping her tone even. Victor glanced up mid-bite. "Good." Just one word. That was his style. Direct, efficient. But for Danielle, it was an opening. "Would you like more wine?" she offered. He tilted his glass slightly, watching the dark liquid swirl. "Sure." Danielle reached for the bottle at the service station, then returned. She poured carefully, steadying her hand, even as her heartbeat quickened. As the glass filled, she slipped her other hand into her apron pocket. The paper felt heavier now, like it carried more than ink, like it carried years of silence. She placed the bottle down, then leaned just slightly closer. In a single, practiced motion, she slid the folded note under his bread plate, her fingers moving quickly enough that anyone watching would have missed it. Victor's eyes flicked downward. His expression didn't change, but his mind registered the movement. She stepped back immediately, straightening her posture as though nothing had happened. "Enjoy your meal," she said softly, then walked away. Victor didn't touch the note right away. He finished chewing, dabbed his mouth with his napkin, and took another sip of wine. Outwardly, he was calm. Inwardly, curiosity stirred. What kind of waitress slips a billionaire a note? He waited a moment longer, testing his own discipline. Then, when the room's attention shifted back to their own meals, he reached for the paper. It was small, folded twice, the kind of thing a child might pass in a classroom. He slid it from under the plate with the same discretion she had shown. Victor unfolded it slowly, expecting a plea for money, a complaint, maybe even a threat. But the first line made his chest tighten. "I think you need to know the truth about your company." His fork hovered mid-air. He read the line again, making sure he hadn't misinterpreted it. He looked up sharply. Across the room, Danielle was wiping down a table, her face neutral, her movements ordinary. She didn't look at him once. Victor glanced back at the note. Beneath the first line, her handwriting continued, small, neat, deliberate. "It's not about me. It's about someone who paid a price for decisions you probably never knew were made in your name. Ask me about it if you want to hear." His throat went dry. For a man used to controlling every narrative, every detail, those words hit like a punch. They weren't begging. They weren't dramatic. They were a challenge. Victor folded the note again, slipping it into his pocket. His steak sat untouched now, forgotten. For the first time in years, he wasn't hungry. He was unsettled. But instead of confronting her immediately, he sat back in silence, letting the weight of that note settle over him like a storm that hadn't yet broken. Victor leaned back against the leather booth, the note burning in his pocket like a live wire. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of surprises. Usually, he was the one pulling strings, dropping news that made others scramble. Now, in a quiet steakhouse in Kansas City, it was his turn to feel cornered. He waited until Danielle passed by with a tray for another table. When her back was turned, he pulled the note out again. The edges were creased, the ink slightly smudged from her fingers. He unfolded it carefully and read beyond the first two lines. "I don't expect you to believe me. People like me don't usually get heard by people like you. But this is about more than my story. Someone I loved worked for one of your suppliers 3 years ago. He gave everything to keep his job, and when the factory cut corners to save money, it cost him his life. I don't think you ever knew what happened, but I can't stay silent anymore." Victor's jaw clenched. He read the words twice, 3 times. The name of the supplier wasn't written, but he didn't need it. He had overseen dozens of contracts, dozens of companies all bending to meet his standards. Which one was she talking about? His mind flashed through headlines. He remembered a factory fire in St. Louis, a collapse in Tulsa, a machinery accident in Wichita. Were those tied to his empire? He had people for that. Teams who handled liability, teams who sanitized the stories before they ever reached his desk. But here was a woman, no lawyer, no microphone, just a waitress with a note, cutting through the filters he had built his career on. He lowered the paper, staring blankly at the untouched steak in front of him. For the first time, the ribeye looked unappetizing, almost grotesque. "Everything all right, sir?" Victor looked up sharply. Danielle stood there, refilling his water as if nothing had happened. Her tone was polite, neutral, but her eyes said something else. They searched his face, waiting for a sign, bracing for whatever reaction might come. He slipped the note back into his pocket. "Yes, fine." Danielle gave a small nod and walked away, but Victor noticed the way her shoulders stiffened. She knew he'd read it. She was waiting for the fallout. Victor exhaled slowly. His instincts told him to call his assistant, dig into every supplier, find the name, bury it. That was the old reflex, the survival reflex. But another part of him, quieter, less familiar, told him to ask her directly. He sat there, swirling his wine, the note replaying in his mind. "Someone I loved worked for one of your suppliers. It cost him his life." That line, it wasn't about lawsuits or money. It was about grief, about a person she had lost. And suddenly, the weight in her eyes made sense. He set the glass down and pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. No boardroom, no stockholder meeting had ever left him feeling this off balance. After a long pause, Victor raised his hand slightly, signaling her back to his table. Danielle approached, steady but cautious. "Yes, sir?" she asked. Victor studied her, his voice lower than before. Who was he? Danielle froze for a split second. The words had pierced straight to the point she had avoided saying aloud all evening. "My brother," she said quietly. Victor leaned forward. And what happened? Her eyes flicked around the room. Too many ears, too many people. Not here. Not while I'm working. He drummed his fingers against the table, then slid a crisp $100 bill under the edge of his plate. When do you get off? Danielle blinked. Half an hour? Victor gave a sharp nod. Then we'll talk. She pressed her lips together, her hands tightening around the tray she carried. For a moment she looked as if she might back out, but then she gave a small, resolute nod and walked away. Victor watched her go, the note heavy in his pocket once again. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he knew one thing for certain. This was no longer about dinner. But waiting half an hour for answers felt like an eternity. And Victor wasn't a man used to waiting. Victor Langford sat in that booth, the leather pressing against his back, the weight of time crawling like never before. He wasn't used to waiting for anything. In his world, people rearranged their schedules for him. Planes held takeoff. Deals paused mid-signature. But now, all he could do was sip his wine and count the minutes until Danielle's shift ended. At exactly 31 minutes later, she walked past his booth carrying her jacket and bag. Her apron was gone. Her uniform shirt looked the same, but without the apron, she looked less like a server and more like a woman who had finally decided to speak. Victor stood, outside. It wasn't a question, and she didn't treat it like one. She nodded, then led the way toward the side exit near the parking lot. The night air in Kansas City was cool, a light breeze carrying the faint smell of gasoline from the street. The restaurant's neon sign buzzed overhead, but out here it was quieter. Danielle crossed her arms, facing him. You read it? Victor reached into his pocket, pulling out the folded note once more. He held it between his fingers, studying her face. I read it, but I want to hear it from you, all of it. Her throat worked before she spoke. 3 years ago, my brother, Anthony Moore, worked at Riverbend Textiles. You remember that name? Victor frowned. He did. The company had supplied cheap fabric to one of his subsidiaries. Go on. They kept the machines running 24 hours a day, barely maintained them. He told me they'd been complaining for months. Management ignored it. One night, a press jammed. He went in to fix it. The safety lock didn't hold. She paused, her voice catching. He didn't come home. Victor's chest tightened. He remembered the headlines. A worker killed in an accident. He remembered the sanitized briefing from his legal team. Tragic but isolated. The company will settle. No direct exposure. That's how they'd framed it. That's how they'd softened it for him. Danielle wasn't softening anything. Her voice carried the raw edge of memory. I was the one who identified his body. My mother, she couldn't even walk into the room. Do you know what it's like to explain to a 7-year-old why her uncle isn't coming back? Victor inhaled slowly, his jaw set. And you believe this falls on me? She stepped closer, eyes burning. Your empire squeezes suppliers until they cut corners. They cut corners until people get hurt. And when people get hurt, men like you look the other way. Tell me I'm wrong. Her words cut deeper than she knew. Victor's silence stretched, and for the first time, Danielle saw cracks in his armor. His hands weren't steady. His eyes weren't cold. Finally, he spoke, voice low. I didn't know. Danielle let out a sharp laugh, not out of humor, but disbelief. You didn't want to know. There's a difference. The neon light flickered across his face, carving shadows under his eyes. He thought of the countless reports, the briefings he skimmed, the assurances from managers who were paid to keep him comfortable. He thought of his reputation as the man who demanded results at any cost. For the first time in years, he wondered what the real cost had been. Danielle's arms dropped to her sides. Her voice softened, but it carried more weight than ever. I don't need your money. I don't need a handout. I just needed you to know. Someone had to say it to your face, because if I didn't, Anthony would just be another name erased by your bottom line. Victor studied her. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't bargaining. She was telling him the truth, raw and unpolished. He exhaled, a sound that was almost a growl. Why me? Why tonight? Because you came here, she said simply, and because I had the note in my pocket long enough. It was time. The silence stretched between them. Cars passed by on the street, headlights flashing across the lot, but neither moved. Victor felt something he hadn't felt in years, the sting of accountability. Finally, he spoke again, slower this time. What do you want me to do with this? Danielle held his gaze. That's the part you'll have to figure out. Victor stared at her, the note still clutched in his hand. For the first time, he felt the paper as more than paper. It was weight. It was judgment. It was a demand he couldn't delegate. But as much as he wanted to walk away, something in Danielle's eyes kept him rooted to that parking lot. And he knew the conversation wasn't over yet. The night air pressed heavier now. Neither of them moved, as though the parking lot itself demanded silence before the truth could come out. Victor finally broke it. Tell me about him, he said. His voice was quieter than before, stripped of authority. Danielle blinked, surprised at the request. She hugged her arms against her chest, as if holding her brother close through memory. Anthony was stubborn, she said with a faint smile. The kind of guy who would give you his last dollar and then argue with you about it. He was good with machines, could fix anything. Cars, washers, those factory presses. He wanted to start his own repair shop one day. Said he was tired of punching clocks for people who didn't care if he lived or died. Her voice faltered, but she pressed on. He only stayed at Riverbend because the benefits covered my mom's medication. I begged him to quit, but he wouldn't. Said family came first. Always. Victor shifted his weight, staring at the asphalt under his polished shoes. Danielle's words painted Anthony not as a statistic in a report, but as a man with dreams, a man trapped by circumstances Victor had never experienced. Why wasn't this in the report? Victor asked, more to himself than to her. Danielle shook her head. Because people like Anthony don't make reports. They're written out of them. By the time it reaches your desk, it's all legal language and payout numbers. No names, no faces. Victor's throat tightened. He remembered that file. Thin, clean, sanitized. A single paragraph summary followed by settlement figures. He hadn't thought about it since, until now. Danielle stepped closer, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. When he died, we didn't even get a call. Not from the company, not from anyone. A coworker showed up at our door. That was it. You want to know what it's like to bury your brother with borrowed money while reading about your company's record profits in the same week? Her words cut like knives. Victor's silence stretched, but this time it wasn't cold, it was heavy. Finally, he said, "You blame me." "I don't just blame you," Danielle said. "I blame a system that rewards people like you for squeezing until something breaks. But you're at the top, and at the top, pretending not to see doesn't make you innocent." Victor looked at her, the note still in his hand. He could have torn it, walked away, retreated to the safety of numbers and lawyers, but he didn't. Something about Danielle, her steadiness, her refusal to beg, made him stay rooted. "I built everything on efficiency," he admitted, his voice low, "on cutting waste, demanding more. I told myself it was survival, but maybe it was just greed dressed up in discipline." Danielle studied him, surprised by the honesty. "So what now?" Victor exhaled, staring into the dark horizon beyond the parking lot. For once, he didn't have an immediate answer. His entire life had been about control, knowing the next move before anyone else did. Tonight, he had no script. Danielle let out a slow breath. "You don't have to answer me. I just wanted you to hear it, to look someone in the eye and know what it costs." Victor looked back at her. "And what about you? You've been carrying this. Why tell me now?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Because my daughter asked me why Uncle Anthony never came to her school play, and I realized I was teaching her silence. I couldn't keep doing that." Victor swallowed hard. That was the part that pierced deeper than any accusation. A child growing up with questions no one wanted to answer. The sound of a car engine rumbled as someone pulled into the lot, headlights sweeping across them, then fading as the car parked on the far side. Neither of them moved. Victor finally spoke, his tone lower, almost raw. "I can't change what happened to him, but I can't pretend I don't know anymore, either." Danielle searched his face, trying to see if he meant it. She didn't need his money. She didn't need his pity. She needed to know her brother's life hadn't been invisible. For a long moment, they just stood there, two people from worlds that never should have collided, bound by a note and a tragedy that refused to be buried. But Victor wasn't a man who left things unfinished. And Danielle could see the gears beginning to turn behind his eyes. Victor didn't leave that parking lot the same man who had walked in for a steak. Something inside him had shifted. Not completely, no one changes in an instant, but Danielle's words had cracked the walls he had spent decades building. He stared at her one last time, the paper still folded in his hand. "Your brother's name, Anthony Moore." Danielle nodded. "I'll remember it," he said. The promise sounded strange on his tongue. Promises weren't part of his language. Deals were, contracts were. But this was different. Danielle gave him a small, tired smile. Not forgiveness, not closure, just acknowledgement. And for her, that was enough for tonight. She turned to leave, her bag slung over her shoulder. Before she walked away completely, she said, "I don't expect you to fix the world. Just don't forget what you heard tonight." Victor stood there, the parking lot lights casting a hard glow on his suit. He could have gone back inside, finished his meal, returned to his empire as though nothing happened. But he didn't. He slid into his car, started the engine, and sat there, motionless, replaying every word. The next morning, in his corner office overlooking downtown, Victor didn't open his stock reports first. He didn't check his emails. He picked up the phone and called his legal department. "Send me every incident report from our suppliers. I don't care how old. I want names, not numbers." There was a pause on the other end. His lawyers weren't used to those instructions. But Victor didn't care. He thought of Anthony Moore, of a little girl asking why her uncle missed her play, of Danielle carrying grief in her apron pocket. For the first time in years, profit margins didn't feel like victory. They felt like blood on a ledger. That night, back at the Ironwood Grill, Danielle clocked in for another shift. Same uniform, same tables, same tired smile. But when she passed Victor's usual booth, it was empty. For a moment, she wondered if he had walked out of her life just as quickly as he entered it. But then her manager called her over. "Someone left this for you," he said, holding out an envelope. Inside was no check, no payout, no offer to buy her silence. Just a single sheet of paper with 5 words written in neat handwriting. "I heard you. I remember." Danielle folded the paper carefully, tucking it into her apron pocket. Right where the note to him had been. Her brother's memory lived there now, carried forward not as silence, but as truth. For Victor, it was the start of a reckoning. For Danielle, it was proof that even the most powerful man in the room could be forced to listen. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin change. Because sometimes, the loudest voice doesn't come from a boardroom or a headline. It comes from a tired waitress, a folded note, and the courage to say what others stay quiet about. We often think our voices don't matter against power, wealth, or influence. But silence protects no one. Speaking the truth, even to someone who seems untouchable, can plant a seed that changes everything. Never underestimate the weight of your words. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs reminding that their voice matters. And remember, sometimes the smallest act of courage is the one that leaves the deepest mark.